The London streets buzzed with their usual evening energy as tourists and locals alike made their way through the historic district. Street lamps cast long shadows across the cobblestones, and the sound of laughter echoed from nearby pubs. Among the crowd, Marcus Thompson stumbled along the sidewalk. His tie loosened and his business suit wrinkled from a long day that had ended with too many drinks at his office farewell party. Marcus had just been promoted to a position in Manchester, and his colleagues had insisted on celebrating his last day in London. What started as a few casual drinks had turned into hours of toasting, storytelling, and reminiscing about their time working together. Now, several pints of ale later, Marcus found himself wandering through the tourist district, his phone dead and his sense of direction completely compromised. The evening air was crisp, and Marcus pulled his jacket tighter around himself as he tried to figure out where exactly he was. The alcohol had made everything seem both incredibly funny and slightly confusing. Street signs seemed to blur together, and he kept stopping to squint at building numbers that refused to stay still long enough for him to read them properly. As he rounded a corner, Marcus noticed a crowd of people gathered ahead, all pointing their cameras and phones towards something that seemed to be drawing quite a bit of attention. His curiosity piqued, and with the confidence that only comes from several drinks, he decided to investigate what all the fuss was about. Pushing through the crowd with the determination of someone who believed he belonged there, Marcus found himself face to face with one of London's most iconic sights. A royal guard stood perfectly still in his traditional red uniform and tall black hat, his expression stoic and unchanging, despite the dozens of tourists taking photos around him. Next to the guard stood a magnificent black horse, equally still and dignified, its coat gleaming under the streetlights. Marcus had seen pictures of the royal guards countless times, but he had never encountered one in person. The alcohol in his system made everything seem more impressive and dramatic than usual. The guard's uniform appeared to sparkle. The horse looked like something from a fairy tale, and the whole scene struck Marcus as absolutely magnificent. Other tourists were keeping a respectful distance, snapping photos and whispering to each other about the traditions and history of the royal guard. Parents pointed out the guard to their children, explaining in hushed tones about the important job these soldiers did protecting the royal family. Everyone seemed to understand that this was a moment to observe quietly and respectfully. Marcus, however, was not thinking about respect or tradition. The combination of alcohol and the excitement of seeing something so famous had filled him with a sense of adventure that completely overrode his usually sensible nature. In his intoxicated state, he began to think that this was exactly the kind of experience he needed to cap off his farewell celebration. The horse, in particular, caught his attention. It stood so perfectly still, so majestic and patient, that Marcus began to wonder what it would be like to sit on such a noble animal. In his alcohol-clouded mind, this seemed not only like a reasonable thought but like an absolutely brilliant idea that would make for an unforgettable end to his time in London. Marcus began to inch closer to the horse, his movements unsteady but determined. The other tourists noticed his approach and started to move back, sensing that something was about to happen that they probably should not get too close to. Some began to hold their phones higher, instinctively knowing that whatever was about to unfold would be worth recording. The royal guard remained motionless, his training keeping him focused straight ahead despite the obvious disruption that was approaching his position. The guard had dealt with curious tourists before, but there was something about this man's determined stumbling that suggested this situation might be different from the usual photo requests and questions about his job. Marcus reached the horse's side and placed his hand on its flank, marveling at how warm and solid the animal felt. The horse shifted slightly but remained calm, trained to deal with various situations and distractions. Marcus looked up at the saddle, which suddenly seemed much higher than it had from a distance, but his determination remained unshaken. The crowd around them had grown larger, and people were beginning to murmur to each other about what they thought this disheveled man in a business suit might be planning to do. Some tourists looked concerned, others seemed excited about the potential for drama, and a few were already recording video on their phones, sensing that this was going to be one of those unexpected moments that would end up shared across social media. Marcus took a step back from the horse and looked around at all the faces watching him. For a brief moment, a small voice in the back of his mind suggested that maybe this was not such a good idea after all. But the alcohol quickly silenced that voice, replacing it with a surge of confidence and a feeling that he was about to do something truly memorable. He began to circle around to the horse's left side, the traditional mounting side, his eyes fixed on the saddle with the focus of someone who had just discovered their life's purpose. The royal guard's eyes remained straight ahead, but there was a subtle tension in his posture that suggested he was very much aware of what was happening beside him. As Marcus prepared for what he believed would be his triumphant moment, the evening air seemed to hold its breath. The tourists stopped their chattering. The street sounds seemed to fade, and even the horse appeared to sense that something significant was about to happen. Marcus placed his hands on the saddle, took a deep breath, and prepared to attempt something that would indeed send him yelling, though not quite in the way he was expecting. Marcus gripped the saddle with both hands, his alcohol-impaired coordination making the simple act of mounting a horse seem like climbing Mount Everest. The leather felt smooth and expensive under his sweaty palms, and he could smell the distinctive scent of well-maintained tack mixed with the horse's natural warmth. What he had imagined would be a smooth, graceful mounting quickly turned into an awkward struggle that drew even more attention from the growing crowd. His first attempt involved trying to swing his leg up and over the horse's back in one fluid motion, the way he had seen in countless movies. However, his business shoes had no grip on the stirrups. His suit pants were too tight for such athletic movements, and his balance was compromised by the several pints of ale he had consumed. Instead of landing gracefully in the saddle, Marcus found himself hanging halfway up the horse's side, one leg dangling uselessly while he tried to pull himself up with his arms. The horse, a well-trained animal accustomed to carrying experienced riders, sensed immediately that something was very wrong with this particular mounting attempt. The animal shifted its weight slightly, trying to maintain balance as this strange, unsteady person struggled to climb aboard. The horse's movement, though minimal, was enough to throw off Marcus's already precarious position. The royal guard remained in his official stance, but his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. These guards were trained to handle many situations, from tourists asking for photos to protesters trying to disrupt their duties. However, dealing with intoxicated civilians attempting to mount their horses was not something covered extensively in their training manual. The guard's eyes remained fixed straight ahead, but every muscle in his body was alert and ready to respond if the situation escalated further. Marcus, still hanging halfway onto the horse, began to make grunting sounds as he tried to haul himself up. His face turned red from both the physical exertion and the alcohol in his system. Sweat began to bead on his forehead despite the cool evening air. The crowd around them had grown to nearly 50 people, with tourists holding up their phones to record what was quickly becoming the most entertaining thing they had witnessed during their London visit. Some of the onlookers began to whisper among themselves, with parents covering their children's eyes and elderly tourists shaking their heads in disapproval. A few people in the crowd started to call out warnings, though whether they were concerned for Marcus's safety or the horse's well-being was unclear. One woman with a thick Australian accent could be heard saying to her husband, "Only in London would you see something like this." The horse, growing increasingly uncomfortable with the situation, began to take small steps sideways. These movements, designed to shake off the unwanted passenger, had the opposite effect on Marcus. Instead of discouraging him, the horse's motions seemed to fuel his determination. In his intoxicated state, he interpreted the animal's movements as encouragement, as if the horse was trying to help him get settled into the saddle. Marcus managed to get his right leg partway over the horse's back, though he was nowhere near properly seated. He was essentially lying across the saddle sideways, his feet still on the ground, his suit jacket riding up his back and his tie hanging down toward the pavement. His breathing was heavy and labored, and he began to realize that this was significantly more difficult than he had anticipated. The royal guard, finally recognizing that this situation required intervention, began to turn his head slightly toward Marcus. This small movement, barely perceptible to most observers, was actually a significant break in protocol. Royal guards are trained to remain motionless and focus straight ahead regardless of distractions, but the welfare of their horses takes precedence over ceremonial duties. At this moment, Marcus made what would prove to be a crucial mistake. Misinterpreting the guard's slight head movement as acknowledgement or perhaps even approval, Marcus felt a surge of confidence. He believed he was making progress and that his plan was working. With renewed determination, he attempted to swing his left leg up and over the horse in what he imagined would be the final, successful mounting maneuver. However, Marcus had seriously overestimated both his athletic ability and his coordination in his current state. As he tried to swing his leg over, his foot caught on the stirrup, his hand slipped on the saddle, and his body weight shifted in a way that the horse found completely unacceptable. The animal, which had been patient up to this point, decided that enough was enough. The horse took several quick steps forward, a movement that completely destroyed Marcus's precarious balance. His grip on the saddle failed, his foot came free from the stirrup, and he found himself falling backward toward the cobblestone street. Time seemed to slow down as Marcus realized that his brilliant plan was about to end very differently than he had imagined. The crowd around them reacted with a collective gasp, and several people instinctively stepped forward as if they might be able to help. Though they were all too far away to actually intervene, the sound of dozens of camera phones recording the moment created a subtle electronic humming that mixed with the gasps and exclamations of the tourists. As Marcus fell, his arms windmilled frantically in an attempt to regain his balance, but gravity and physics were working against him. His suit jacket flapped open. His tie flew up toward his face, and his expression changed from determined confidence to shocked surprise in the span of less than a second. The realization that he was about to hit the ground hard was beginning to penetrate through the alcoholic haze that had gotten him into this situation in the first place. Marcus hit the cobblestone street with a sound that made everyone in the crowd wince simultaneously. The impact was not as graceful as movie stunts would suggest, and the hard stones showed no mercy for his alcohol-softened reflexes. He landed, primarily on his back and side, his expensive business suit now decorated with street dust and his carefully styled hair completely disheveled. For a moment he lay there blinking at the evening sky, trying to process what had just happened. The horse, now free of its unwanted passenger, took a few more steps away and settled back into its professional stance, though its ears remained alert and its eyes showed the kind of wariness that comes from dealing with unpredictable humans. The animal's training had served it well, and it had handled the situation exactly as it had been taught, removing the threat without causing unnecessary harm to anyone involved. The Royal Guard, meanwhile, maintained his position, but his eyes had definitely shifted to assess the situation. While he could not abandon his post to help Marcus, his posture indicated that he was ready to call for assistance if the man appeared to be seriously injured. The guard's face remained impassive, but those who knew what to look for could see the subtle signs that he was processing the incident and determining the appropriate response. Marcus slowly pushed himself up into a sitting position, his head spinning from both the alcohol and the impact with the ground. His first instinct was to look around and see who had witnessed his spectacular failure. What he saw was approximately 60 tourists, all holding phones and cameras, all pointed directly at him. The realization that his embarrassing moment had been recorded by dozens of people began to penetrate through his alcoholic haze. The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some people were laughing openly, finding the entire situation hilarious and entertaining. Others looked concerned, genuinely worried that Marcus might have hurt himself in the fall. A few appeared disapproving, clearly viewing his behavior as disrespectful to both the Royal Guard and the horse. Several parents were using the moment as a teaching opportunity, explaining to their children why it was important to respect barriers and follow rules. One elderly gentleman with a walking stick stepped forward and asked in a kind but firm voice, "Are you all right, son?" His tone suggested both concern for Marcus's well-being and disapproval of his actions. The man's wife stood beside him, shaking her head and muttering something about young people these days and too much drink. Marcus attempted to stand up, which proved to be more challenging than expected. His legs felt unsteady, his suit was twisted around his body in uncomfortable ways, and his pride was significantly more bruised than his physical person. As he struggled to get to his feet, he became aware of a new problem. His attempted mount had not only failed spectacularly, but it had also attracted the attention of people who were definitely not tourists. Two police officers were approaching through the crowd, their uniforms and purposeful stride immediately recognizable, even to someone in Marcus's current state. The officers had been patrolling the tourist district when they received reports of a disturbance involving the Royal Guard. They moved with the kind of calm professionalism that suggested they had dealt with similar situations before, though perhaps not involving quite so much alcohol and ambition. The taller of the two officers, Constable Williams, reached Marcus first and offered him a hand up. "Evening, sir," he said in a tone that was polite but carried an unmistakable note of authority. "Having a bit of trouble tonight, are we?" His partner, Constable Martinez, positioned herself nearby and began to disperse the crowd, asking people to move along and stop recording. Marcus accepted the help getting to his feet, though he immediately regretted the quick movement as it made his head spin even more violently. "I was just trying to," he began, then stopped, realizing that any explanation he might offer would likely sound even worse than what had actually happened. The alcohol that had given him the confidence to attempt mounting the horse was now making it difficult to form coherent sentences. Constable Williams looked Marcus up and down, taking in the disheveled suit, the smell of alcohol, and the general state of confusion that surrounded him like a cloud. "Sir, I'm going to need to see some identification," the officer said, pulling out a small notebook. "And then we're going to have a conversation about respecting public monuments and the animals in service to the Crown." The word Crown seemed to penetrate Marcus's alcohol-fogged brain like a splash of cold water. For the first time since he had spotted the horse, he began to understand the seriousness of what he had attempted to do. This was not just any horse. This was a Royal Guards horse, a working animal in service to the monarchy, and he had just tried to mount it like it was a pony ride at a fair. Marcus fumbled through his pockets for his wallet, his hands shaking slightly from both the adrenaline and the gradual sobering effect of his current situation. As he searched for his identification, he became increasingly aware of the crowd, still gathered around them, despite Constable Martinez's efforts to move them along. The cameras were still recording, and he realized with growing horror that this incident was probably already being uploaded to social media platforms around the world. The Royal Guard, who had remained remarkably composed throughout the entire incident, finally received permission to break his stance as a replacement guard arrived to take his position. He approached the group of officers and Marcus with the kind of measured steps that spoke of years of military training. When he reached them, he stood at attention and addressed Constable Williams directly. "The horse is unharmed, Constable," the guard reported in a crisp, professional tone. The individual made contact with the animal but did not succeed in mounting. The animal responded appropriately to remove the threat. His report was brief and factual, but Marcus could hear something in the guard's voice that suggested this was not the first time he had dealt with intoxicated tourists, though perhaps it was the first time someone had actually attempted to ride his horse. As the full weight of his actions began to sink in, Marcus felt his face flush with embarrassment that had nothing to do with the alcohol in his system. He looked at the guard, then at the officers, then at the remaining crowd of onlookers, and realized that his farewell celebration had taken a turn that he would definitely remember, but probably not in the way he had intended. Marcus handed over his driver's license with trembling fingers, watching as Constable Williams examined it carefully and began writing information in his notebook. The officer's pen moved with practiced efficiency, recording details that Marcus knew would become part of some kind of official record. The reality of facing potential legal consequences was beginning to cut through the alcoholic fog that had seemed so amusing just minutes earlier. "Marcus Thompson," Constable Williams read aloud, age 32, address in Hammersmith. He looked up at Marcus with the expression of someone who had seen this type of situation many times before. "Mr. Thompson, can you tell me how much you've had to drink this evening?" The question was asked in a tone that suggested the officer already had a pretty good idea of the answer, based on Marcus's appearance and behavior. Marcus tried to think back through the evening's festivities, but the timeline had become somewhat blurry. "I had a few drinks at my farewell party," he admitted, his voice sounding smaller and more uncertain than he would have liked. "Maybe more than a few. We were celebrating my promotion." As soon as the words left his mouth, he realized how pathetic they sounded as an explanation for attempting to mount a Royal Guard's horse. The Royal Guard, still standing at attention nearby, maintained his professional demeanor, but Marcus caught what might have been the slightest hint of sympathy in the man's eyes. Perhaps the guard understood that people sometimes made spectacularly poor decisions when alcohol was involved, Or perhaps he was simply relieved that neither he nor his horse had been injured during the incident. Constable Martinez returned from her crowd control duties and approached her partner. "The tourists are mostly dispersed," she reported, "but several of them got good footage of the whole thing. It's probably already making the rounds on social media." She glanced at Marcus with an expression that seemed to say she felt sorry for him, knowing that his embarrassing moment would likely live forever on the internet. This news hit Marcus like another fall from the horse. In his alcohol-induced state, he had not considered the long-term consequences of his actions beyond the immediate thrill of the moment. Now he was faced with the realization that his attempt to mount a Royal Guards horse had been recorded by dozens of people and would probably be viewed by thousands, if not millions, of strangers who would judge him for this moment of spectacularly poor judgment. Constable Williams continued his questioning, asking Marcus about his employment, his reason for being in the area, and his general state of mind. Each question seemed designed to determine whether Marcus was simply drunk and stupid, or if there might be more serious issues at play. Marcus answered as honestly as he could, explaining about his job change, the farewell party, and his decision to wander through the tourist district afterward. As they talked, Marcus became increasingly aware of the physical discomfort he was experiencing. His back ached from the fall, his suit was uncomfortable and twisted, and he was beginning to feel nauseated from the combination of alcohol and adrenaline. The cool evening air that had felt refreshing earlier now seemed cold and unwelcoming, and he shivered slightly as he stood there being questioned by the police officers. The horse, meanwhile, had returned to its professional duties as if nothing had happened. The animal's ability to immediately resume its role after dealing with such an unusual disturbance was impressive, and Marcus found himself developing a grudging respect for the creature he had so foolishly tried to mount. The horse's calm professionalism stood in stark contrast to his own chaotic behavior. Constable Williams closed his notebook and looked at Marcus seriously. "Mr. Thompson, what you did tonight was not just foolish. It was potentially dangerous to both yourself and the animal. Royal Guard horses are highly trained working animals, not tourist attractions. They could easily injure someone who interferes with them inappropriately." The officer's tone was educational rather than harsh, suggesting he was more interested in making sure Marcus understood the seriousness of his actions than in simply punishing him. "I understand," Marcus replied, and for the first time that evening, he genuinely did understand. The alcohol was beginning to wear off enough for him to see the situation more clearly, and what he saw was not flattering. He had behaved like exactly the kind of tourist that locals complained about: disrespectful, presumptuous, and completely oblivious to the significance of what he was interfering with. The Royal Guard stepped forward slightly and addressed the officers. "If I may, constables, the gentleman appears to have learned from his mistake. The horse is unharmed, and no real damage has been done beyond some wounded pride." His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions in difficult situations, and his assessment seemed to carry weight with the police officers. Constable Martinez consulted briefly with her partner, and they seemed to reach some kind of decision. She turned back to Marcus and said, "Mr. Thompson, you're going to receive a warning tonight rather than formal charges, but I want you to understand that this is a serious matter. Interfering with Royal Guards or their equipment, including their horses, can result in significant legal consequences, including fines and possible jail time." The mention of jail time made Marcus's stomach drop even further than it already had. He had gone from celebrating a career advancement to potentially facing criminal charges in the span of a few hours, all because he had thought it would be amusing to try to ride a horse. The irony of the situation was not lost on him, though he was not quite ready to appreciate the humor yet. "What happens now?" Marcus asked, genuinely uncertain about the next steps in this process. He had never been in trouble with the law before, and the combination of alcohol embarrassment and genuine concern about his future was making it difficult for him to think clearly about what he should do next. Constable Williams handed him back his license along with a formal warning citation. "You're free to go, Mr. Thompson, but I strongly suggest you find a way to get home safely tonight. No more wandering around the tourist district, and definitely no more interaction with any royal property." The officer's tone suggested that this was as much friendly advice as it was an official instruction. Marcus clutched the warning citation in his shaking hand. staring at the official document that would serve as a permanent reminder of his spectacular lapse in judgment. The paper felt heavier than it should have, weighted with the embarrassment and potential consequences of his actions. As the police officers prepared to leave, he realized he was now facing the challenge of getting home while still significantly intoxicated and thoroughly shaken by the evening's events. The Royal Guard, who had maintained his professional composure throughout the entire incident, gave Marcus a final look that seemed to convey both understanding and a subtle warning. "Sir," he said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen many tourists make poor decisions. "London has many wonderful sights to see, but they're best appreciated from a respectful distance." With that, he returned to his position beside his horse, resuming the stoic stance that had attracted Marcus's attention in the first place. As the officers walked away, and the last of the curious onlookers dispersed, Marcus found himself standing alone on the cobblestone street, his suit disheveled and his pride in tatters. The tourist district that had seemed so exciting and full of possibilities just an hour earlier now felt hostile and unwelcoming. Every passing person seemed to be staring at him, though he could not tell if they had witnessed his humiliation or if paranoia was making him imagine their attention. The practical problem of getting home began to assert itself as the adrenaline from his encounter with the police started to fade. His phone was still dead, he was not entirely sure where he was, and his usual confident navigation of London's transport system seemed impossible in his current state. The alcohol that had given him the false courage to attempt mounting a Royal Guard's horse was now making even simple decisions feel overwhelming. Marcus began walking in what he hoped was the direction of a tube station, his steps unsteady and his progress slow. Every few yards he had to stop and lean against a building or lamppost to steady himself, drawing curious looks from passing pedestrians. His expensive suit, which had made him feel so professional and successful earlier in the evening, now felt like a costume that advertised his failure to anyone who cared to look. As he walked, fragments of the evening's events began to replay in his mind with uncomfortable clarity. He remembered the confident way he had approached the horse, the feeling of the saddle under his hands, and most vividly, the moment when he realized he was falling toward the cobblestones. Each memory brought a fresh wave of embarrassment that made his face flush red despite the cool evening air. The sound of laughter from a nearby pub made him pause and consider whether another drink might help him feel better about the situation. For a moment the idea seemed appealing. He could drown his sorrows and maybe find some sympathetic drinking companions who would help him see the humor in what had happened. But even in his intoxicated state, he recognized that more alcohol was probably the last thing he needed right now. Instead, Marcus continued his slow progress through the London streets, occasionally asking passers-by for directions to the nearest underground station. Most people were helpful, though he noticed that several of them seemed to be suppressing smiles as they looked at his disheveled appearance. He began to wonder if word of his horse-mounting attempt was already spreading through social media, and if these strangers somehow knew what he had done. When he finally reached a tube station, Marcus discovered that navigating the underground system while intoxicated was significantly more challenging than he had anticipated. The escalator seemed steeper and faster than usual, the platform maps were difficult to focus on, and the noise of approaching trains felt overwhelming. Several times he had to sit down on benches and close his eyes to combat waves of nausea and dizziness. A kind elderly woman noticed his distress and asked if he needed help. "You look a bit worse for wear, love," she said with genuine concern. "Are you all right?" Her kindness was almost more than Marcus could handle in his emotional state, and he found himself fighting back tears as he explained that he just needed to get home to Hammersmith. The woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Patterson, seemed to understand immediately that Marcus was dealing with more than just too much alcohol. She helped him figure out which train he needed, and even rode with him for several stops to make sure he did not get lost or fall asleep and miss his destination. As they sat together on the train, she chatted about her own experiences with London's nightlife and shared stories about her late husband's occasional overindulgences. Mrs. Patterson's gentle conversation and maternal presence helped Marcus begin to process what had happened to him. For the first time since falling off the horse, he was able to think about the incident without feeling completely overwhelmed by embarrassment and self-recrimination. The woman's matter-of-fact attitude toward his obviously intoxicated state helped him realize that while his behavior had been foolish, it was not necessarily the end of the world. When it came time for Mrs. Patterson to change trains, she made sure Marcus was alert enough to continue his journey safely. "Everyone makes mistakes, dear," she told him as she prepared to leave. "The important thing is learning from them and not letting them define you." Her words were simple, but they carried the weight of someone who had lived long enough to see many people struggle with their own poor decisions. As Marcus continued his journey home alone, he began to think about what Mrs. Patterson had said. The woman's kindness had reminded him that while his actions had been embarrassing and potentially serious, they were not necessarily life-defining. People had survived worse mistakes, and he would probably survive this one too, though it might take some time for his ego to recover fully. The train ride gave him time to consider the practical consequences of his actions beyond the immediate embarrassment. He would need to be more careful about his alcohol consumption in the future, especially in public settings. He would probably need to avoid certain areas of London for a while, at least until the likelihood of encountering people who might recognize him from social media videos had diminished. Most importantly, he would need to find a way to learn from this experience rather than simply trying to forget it had happened. Marcus finally reached his flat in Hammersmith well after midnight, his key fumbling against the lock as he struggled with coordination that seemed to worsen with each passing hour. The familiar surroundings of his own building felt like a sanctuary after the chaos of the evening, and he practically collapsed against his front door once he managed to get it open. The silence of his empty apartment was a stark contrast to the noise and attention he had endured throughout his journey home. The first thing he did was plug in his phone and wait for it to power up, dreading what he might find when it finally connected to the internet. As the device came to life, it immediately began buzzing with notifications, missed calls, text messages, and social media alerts that made his stomach sink with the realization that his humiliation had indeed spread. Beyond the immediate crowd of tourists who had witnessed it, his best friend James had left several increasingly concerned voicemails, starting with cheerful inquiries about how the farewell party had gone, and progressing to worried questions about where Marcus was and whether he was safe. The messages painted a clear picture of someone who had seen or heard about the incident and was genuinely concerned about Marcus's well-being, which somehow made the situation feel both better and worse at the same time. The social media notifications were more difficult to face. Several people had tagged him in videos and photos from the evening, and the comments ranged from amused to critical to genuinely sympathetic. One video, which appeared to have been viewed several thousand times already, showed his entire attempted mounting sequence followed by his spectacular fall, set to comedy music that made the whole thing look like a slapstick routine from a television show. Marcus sat on his sofa, still wearing his wrinkled and dirt-stained suit, and watched himself fail to mount a Royal Guards horse over and over again. Each viewing revealed new details that he had not noticed at the time. The way his tie had flapped around his face, the expression of patient resignation on the horse's face, and the moment when the Royal Guard had subtly shifted his attention to assess the situation developing beside him. The comments on the videos were a mixture that reflected the diversity of internet opinion. Some people found the whole thing hilarious and shared it with their own followers, adding laughing emojis and jokes about British tourism. Others were more critical, pointing out the disrespect shown to the Royal Guard and expressing concern for the welfare of the horse. A few commenters even defended Marcus, suggesting that everyone had done embarrassing things while drunk, and that he did not deserve to have his worst moment broadcast to the world. Reading through the comments, Marcus began to notice that many people were sharing their own stories of alcohol-fueled poor decisions. One person wrote about the time they had tried to pet a police horse and ended up spending the night in jail. Another shared a story about attempting to take a selfie with a Buckingham Palace guard and accidentally knocking over a barrier. The stories helped Marcus realize that, while his particular mistake might have been unusual, the general category of tourist does something stupid while drunk was apparently quite common. His phone rang, interrupting his social media investigation. James's name appeared on the screen, and Marcus knew he could not avoid this conversation any longer. His friend's voice was a mixture of concern and barely suppressed laughter when he answered. "Marcus, mate, please tell me you're all right. I've been seeing videos of you all over social media, and I've been worried sick." Marcus found himself explaining the entire evening to James, from the farewell party through his wandering the tourist district to his encounter with the Royal Guard's horse. As he told the story aloud, it began to take on an almost surreal quality, as if it had happened to someone else entirely. James listened without interruption, occasionally making sympathetic noises or asking for clarification about particularly unbelievable details. When Marcus finished his account, there was a moment of silence before James began to laugh. Not the cruel laughter of someone mocking a friend's misfortune, but the relieved laughter of someone who had been genuinely worried and was now able to see the absurd humor in the situation. "Marcus," James said between chuckles, "I have to admit, when I heard you were moving to Manchester, I expected you might do something memorable for your last night in London, but this definitely exceeded my expectations." The conversation with James helped Marcus begin to process the evening's events in a healthier way. His friend's reaction, concern followed by amused relief, helped him understand that while his behavior had been embarrassing and inappropriate, it was not the kind of mistake that would define him permanently. James shared stories about other mutual friends who had made spectacular errors in judgment while drinking, and gradually Marcus began to feel less like a unique failure and more like someone who had simply had a very bad night. After hanging up with James, Marcus finally changed out of his ruined suit and took a long, hot shower. The warm water helped wash away not just the dirt and grime from his fall, but also some of the lingering embarrassment and shame he had been carrying. As he stood under the shower, he began to think about how he would handle the aftermath of this incident and what he could learn from the experience. The next morning brought a hangover that felt well-deserved and a clearer perspective on the previous night's events. Marcus's phone continued to buzz with notifications, but the initial surge of viral attention seemed to be settling into a more manageable level of internet chatter. He spent some time reading through the comments and messages, responding to friends who had reached out with concern and ignoring the stranger critics, who seemed to have nothing better to do than judge his moment of poor judgment. One message stood out from the rest. It was from his new supervisor in Manchester, who had somehow learned about the incident and wanted to make sure Marcus was all right. The message was professional but kind, expressing concern for Marcus's well-being and assuring him that one night of poor judgment would not affect his new position. The supervisor even shared a brief story about his own youthful indiscretions, suggesting that most people understood the difference between a momentary lapse and a pattern of poor behavior. This unexpected show of support from his new employer helped Marcus realize that his fears about the incident ruining his career prospects were probably overblown. While the video would likely follow him around the internet for a while, most reasonable people would understand that everyone makes mistakes, especially when alcohol is involved. The key would be learning from the experience and demonstrating better judgment in the future. As the day progressed, Marcus began to receive messages from people who had been inspired by his story to share their own embarrassing moments. A woman from Australia wrote about the time she had tried to feed a kangaroo and ended up being chased across a park. A man from Germany shared a story about accidentally walking into the wrong wedding reception and staying for 3 hours before anyone noticed. These stories helped Marcus understand that embarrassing moments were a universal human experience, and that most people were more understanding and sympathetic than he had initially feared. By the end of the day, Marcus had developed a plan for moving forward. He would acknowledge his mistake honestly when asked about it, express genuine remorse for his disrespectful behavior, and use the experience as a reminder to be more mindful of his alcohol consumption in the future. He would not try to hide from what had happened or pretend it had not occurred, but he would also not let it define him or prevent him from enjoying his new opportunities in Manchester. The incident had taught him several valuable lessons about respect, responsibility, and the permanent nature of actions in the age of social media. While he would probably never live down his attempt to mount a Royal Guards horse, he could at least ensure that he learned from the experience and became a better person as a result. The embarrassment would fade. The internet would move on to new viral content, and he would have a story that would probably become more amusing with time and distance. 3 months later, Marcus was settling into his new life in Manchester when he received an unexpected phone call that would bring his London horse incident full circle in the most surprising way possible. The caller identified himself as Sergeant David Morrison, from the Household Cavalry, the unit responsible for the royal guards that Marcus had encountered on that memorable evening. Marcus's heart immediately began racing, assuming he was in some kind of delayed trouble from his drunken adventure. However, Sergeant Morrison's tone was friendly rather than official, and his reason for calling was completely unexpected. The cavalry unit was putting together a public awareness campaign about respecting royal property and the working animals in service to the crown. They wanted to use Marcus's incident as a case study, but rather than simply using the viral video without permission, they wanted to invite him to participate in creating educational content that would help prevent similar situations in the future. Marcus was initially speechical, unable to process the idea that his most embarrassing moment might actually be turned into something constructive and educational. Sergeant Morrison explained that the cavalry had been dealing with an increasing number of tourists who did not understand the serious nature of the Royal Guard's duties or the potential dangers of interfering with their horses. Marcus's incident, while embarrassing for him personally, had actually sparked important conversations about tourist behavior and animal welfare. The sergeant went on to explain that the video of Marcus's attempt to mount the horse had become something of a teaching tool within the cavalry, showing new guards exactly the kind of situation they might need to handle with patience and professionalism. The guard who had been on duty that night, Trooper Williams, had received commendation for his calm handling of the situation and his ability to ensure both Marcus's safety and the horse's well-being throughout the incident. After several days of consideration and consultation with James and his family, Marcus agreed to participate in the campaign. The experience would involve returning to London to film educational segments, meet with the cavalry unit, and even encounter the same horse he had attempted to mount, though this time under much more controlled and respectful circumstances. The filming day was both nerve-wracking and cathartic for Marcus. Standing once again next to the beautiful black horse, now properly introduced to him as Cromwell, he felt a mixture of embarrassment about his previous behavior and genuine admiration for the animal's grace and training. Cromwell seemed completely unfazed by Marcus's presence, displaying the kind of professional indifference that only came from years of dealing with unpredictable humans. Trooper Williams, the guard who had been on duty during Marcus's incident, participated in the filming with good humor and obvious professionalism. He explained to the camera how Royal Guard horses were highly trained working animals with important jobs to do, and how interference from tourists could potentially endanger both the animals and the people around them. His explanation was educational rather than judgmental, focusing on the importance of maintaining appropriate boundaries rather than criticizing Marcus personally. During breaks in filming, Marcus had the opportunity to learn more about the cavalry and their work. He discovered that Cromwell was not just a ceremonial horse, but also participated in various state functions and had years of specialized training. The horses were athletes in their own right, requiring careful conditioning and maintenance to perform their duties safely and effectively. This knowledge made Marcus even more ashamed of his drunken attempt to treat Cromwell like a theme park attraction. The educational campaign that resulted from Marcus's participation was more successful than anyone had anticipated. The combination of the original viral video and Marcus's honest, self-deprecating explanation of what had gone wrong created content that was both entertaining and genuinely educational. Viewers could laugh at the absurdity of the situation while also learning important lessons about respecting royal property and understanding the serious nature of the Guard's work. Marcus found that participating in the campaign had an unexpectedly positive effect on how he felt about his infamous incident. Instead of being just an embarrassing drunk who had tried to mount a Royal Guards horse, he had become someone who was willing to learn from his mistakes and help others avoid making similar errors. The transformation of his worst moment into something constructive and educational gave him a sense of redemption that he had not expected to find. The campaign also led to an ongoing relationship between Marcus and the Household Cavalry. He became something of an unofficial ambassador for responsible tourism, occasionally speaking to groups about the importance of respecting cultural institutions and understanding the difference between tourist attractions and working facilities. His unique perspective as someone who had learned these lessons the hard way gave his presentations an authenticity that formal educational materials could not match. 6 months after the original incident, Marcus received a final surprise related to his horse-mounting adventure. Trooper Williams contacted him to invite him to attend a ceremony where Cromwell would be retiring from active duty after many years of faithful service. The invitation was extended not just as a courtesy, but as recognition of the role Marcus had inadvertently played in highlighting the important work that horses like Cromwell performed. At the retirement ceremony, Marcus stood with other guests as Cromwell was formally honored for his years of service to the crown. The horse, now wearing special ceremonial tack for the occasion, looked as dignified and professional as ever, showing no signs of remembering the drunk man who had once tried to mount him without permission. For Marcus, seeing Cromwell honored in this way provided a final sense of closure and perspective on an incident that had begun as his most embarrassing moment, but had evolved into one of his most meaningful learning experiences. As he watched the ceremony, Marcus reflected on how a single night of poor judgment had led to unexpected opportunities for growth, education, and service. While he would never recommend his particular path to enlightenment, he had to admit that his drunken encounter with Cromwell had ultimately made him a more thoughtful, responsible, and humble person. Sometimes, he realized, the most embarrassing moments in life could become the most transformative, especially when approached with honesty, humor, and a willingness to learn from one's mistakes.